The studio air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of amplifiers cooling down after a long session. It was late afternoon in Los Angeles, 1973, and the control room felt smaller than it was. 5 men sat scattered across chairs and at the edge of the mixing console, listening to playback through speakers that cost more than most people's cars. No one spoke. The song had just ended, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of waiting. Jackson Browne sat furthest from the glass, leaning back against the wall with his arms crossed loosely over his chest. His hair fell past his shoulders, and his eyes stayed on the floor. He'd been in studios before, but this one mattered. The album mattered. He was 24 years old, and the weight of what he was trying to say with these songs pressed down on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The melodies came easy, the words didn't. He'd spent months wrestling with them, trying to capture something honest about loneliness, about love that doesn't last, about the space between what you want and what you get. And now in this room with these men, it all felt fragile. The producer sat closest to the board, his fingers still resting on the faders. He was older, maybe 15 years older than Jackson, with the kind of confidence that comes from having worked with people who mattered. He'd produced records that sold. He'd been in rooms with names that carried weight, and he had opinions, strong ones. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled a long stream of smoke, and looked over at Jackson with something that might have been admiration or might have been judgment. It was hard to tell. "You know who you remind me of?" the producer said. His voice was casual, like he was offering a compliment at a dinner party. Jackson didn't look up. He shifted slightly, one hand moving to his knee, but he didn't speak. The room stayed quiet. The other musicians glanced at each other, sensing something fragile about to happen, but not sure what. "Dylan," the producer continued. He said it like it was obvious, like everyone in the room should have already thought it. "You've got that same thing, that introspection, that poetry, the way you turn a phrase. It's like early Dylan before he went electric. You're doing what he did, but your own version." One of the session players nodded slowly, like maybe he agreed, or maybe he just didn't want to disagree. Another looked down at his hands. The comparison hung in the air like a compliment that hadn't been asked for. Jackson still didn't move. His jaw tightened just slightly, enough that you'd only notice if you were watching closely. His eyes stayed on the floor, but something shifted in his posture. He wasn't relaxed anymore. He was holding something back. The producer didn't seem to notice. He was warming to his own idea now, leaning forward, gesturing with his cigarette. "I mean it. You've got that same weight, that same seriousness. People are going to hear this and think of him. That's not a bad thing, Jackson. That's a hell of a thing, actually. Most guys would kill to be mentioned in the same sentence." The room felt smaller now. The hum of the equipment seemed louder. One of the musicians cleared his throat softly, but no one said anything. They were all waiting for Jackson to respond, to accept the compliment, to smile and say thank you. That's what you were supposed to do when someone compared you to Bob Dylan. But Jackson didn't smile. He lifted his head slowly, and for the first time since the producer had started talking, he looked directly at him. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was something quieter than that, something harder to name. There was a sadness in it, or maybe a disappointment, but not the kind that came from being insulted. It was the kind that came from being misunderstood. "I'm not trying to be Bob Dylan," Jackson said. His voice was calm, almost soft, but it cut through the room like a door closing. The producer blinked, caught off guard. He smiled a little, like maybe Jackson was being modest. "I didn't say you were trying to be him. I'm saying you've got something similar. That's a compliment, man." Jackson shook his head slowly, not in anger, not in frustration, just a quiet, firm disagreement. "It's not a compliment if it's not true." The producer's smile faded. He set his cigarette down in the ashtray and leaned back, studying Jackson now with a different kind of attention. The other men in the room stayed still, sensing that this wasn't just about music anymore. It was about something deeper. Jackson took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Dylan writes like he's standing outside the world looking at it, like he's reporting on something he's above. And that's brilliant. I'm not saying it's not, But that's not what I'm doing." He paused, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, like he was choosing his words carefully, not because he was afraid of being misunderstood, but because he wanted to be clear. "I'm not above anything," Jackson said quietly. "I'm in it. I'm writing from inside the mess, the confusion, the hurt. I'm not observing it. I'm living it, and I need people to know that's not the same thing." The producer opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He looked at Jackson for a long moment, and something in his face changed. The certainty that had been there before, the easy confidence of someone who knew how to categorize talent, was gone. In its place was something more uncertain, maybe respect, maybe discomfort, maybe both. One of the session players shifted in his seat, and the leather creaked softly. Another looked away out the window at the palm trees swaying in the late afternoon light. The moment had become something none of them had expected. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even really a disagreement. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable than that. It was a refusal to be reduced. Jackson's hands were still now resting on his knees. He wasn't tense. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just stating a fact about himself, about his work, and he was doing it with a kind of gentle firmness that didn't invite argument. There was no anger in his voice, no edge, but there was something immovable in it. The producer picked up his cigarette again, took a drag, and exhaled slowly. He looked at the console, at the reels of tape still turning slowly, and then back at Jackson. "All right," he said finally. His voice was quieter now, less certain. "I hear you." But Jackson wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes still steady. "Dylan can do what he does because he's got distance. He's got that wall. And maybe that's what makes him great. But I don't have that wall. I don't want it. When I write about loneliness, it's because I'm lonely. When I write about love falling apart, it's because mine did. I'm not trying to make art from a safe place. I'm trying to make it from where I am." His voice didn't rise. It didn't break. But the weight of what he was saying filled the room. The other men didn't look at him. They looked down, or at the floor, or out the window, because looking at him felt like intruding on something private. "I know people are going to compare me to him," Jackson continued. "I know that's going to happen. But every time someone does, it's like they're saying I'm not doing something new, that I'm just copying. And I'm not. I'm trying to be honest in a different way. And if people can't hear that, then I don't know what else to do." There was no bitterness in his words, no self-pity, just a quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from trying to be seen for who you are and constantly being told you look like someone else. The producer set his cigarette down again and rubbed his face with both hands. When he dropped them, he looked older, tired. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I didn't mean to make it sound like that." Jackson didn't respond. He just looked at him, and the look wasn't angry. It was forgiving, but it was also final, like he'd said what he needed to say and wasn't going to repeat it. One of the musicians finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat and said, "Should we listen to the next track?" The producer nodded, grateful for the exit. He turned back to the console and started rewinding the tape. The mechanical whir filled the room, and the tension didn't disappear, but it softened. It became something they could all breathe around. Jackson leaned back against the wall again, his arms crossing loosely over his chest. His face was calm now, almost peaceful. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't stormed out. He hadn't demanded an apology. He just refused to accept a version of himself that wasn't true, and in doing so, he'd forced everyone in the room to see him differently, not as a version of someone else, but as himself. The tape clicked into place, and the producer pressed play. Music filled the room again, and this time, no one compared it to anything. They just listened. The song that came through the speakers was slower than the last one. It opened with a piano line that felt like sunset, like the moment when the light starts to fade and you realize the day is almost over. Jackson's voice came in soft, almost fragile, singing about a woman who left without saying why. The lyrics didn't explain. They didn't offer closure. They just described the empty space she left behind, the way her coffee cup still sat on the counter, the way the bed felt too big now, the way he kept turning to say something to her and remembering she wasn't there. The other musicians in the room listened without moving. They'd played on the track, but hearing it now in this moment after what had just happened, it sounded different. It sounded more naked, more real, like Jackson had pulled something out of himself that most people kept hidden. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long time. The producer stared at the console, his hand resting on the volume knob. One of the session players wiped his eyes quickly, like he didn't want anyone to see. Another just shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something like recognition. Like he'd been there too, like he knew that feeling. The producer finally turned to Jackson. "That's the one," he said quietly. "That's the song people are going to remember." Jackson nodded but didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The song had said it for him. They spent the next hour fine-tuning the mix, adjusting levels, adding a touch of reverb here, pulling back a guitar line there. The work was technical, precise, but it felt different now. There was a respect in the room that hadn't been there before. Not the kind of respect you give to someone famous or powerful, but the kind you give to someone who's shown you something true about themselves. When they finally finished, the producer saved the mix and leaned back in his chair. "I think we're done for today," he said. The other musicians started packing up their instruments, moving slowly, quietly, like they were leaving a church. Jackson stayed in his seat watching them go. One by one, they nodded at him as they left. No one said much. A couple of them touched his shoulder as they passed. It was enough. When the room was empty except for Jackson and the producer, the older man turned to him. "Listen," he said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "I'm sorry about earlier. I wasn't trying to box you in." Jackson looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I know." The producer smiled, but it was a tired smile. "You're doing something different. I see that now. I think a lot of people are going to see it." "Maybe," Jackson said. He stood up and stretched, his back cracking slightly. "Or maybe they'll just keep comparing me to him. Either way, I've got to keep doing what I'm doing." The producer nodded. "Yeah, you do." Jackson grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the door. Before he left, he turned back. "Thanks for today, for listening." "Always," the producer said. Jackson walked out into the late afternoon light. The air outside was warm, and the city stretched out in front of him, endless and indifferent. Cars moved along the street. People walked past without looking at him. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a radio played. Life just kept going the way it always did. He got into his car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and he stared out at the street, thinking about what had happened in that room, thinking about the comparison, thinking about his response, thinking about whether he'd said too much or not enough. But mostly, he thought about the song they'd just mixed, about the woman in the lyrics, about the empty space she'd left, about how some things can't be explained, only described, and how sometimes the most honest thing you can do is admit you don't understand why things happen the way they do. You can only say how they feel. He started the car and pulled out onto the street, merging into the flow of traffic. The radio was off. The windows were down. He drove slowly, in no hurry to get anywhere in particular. That moment in the studio would stay with him, not because it was dramatic or because he'd won some kind of argument, but because it was the first time he'd really stood up for his own voice, the first time he'd refused to be diminished by a comparison, even a flattering one. And in doing that, he'd learned something about himself, that his work wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was, that his songs came from a place of vulnerability, not distance, that he didn't want to be above the pain. He wanted to be honest about it. In the years that followed, Jackson Browne would release albums that defined a generation. Songs like The Pretender and Running on Empty would become anthems for people trying to figure out how to keep going when life got hard. His music would fill arenas. His face would appear on magazine covers. Critics would write long essays about his lyrics, dissecting every line, looking for hidden meanings. And yes, some people would still compare him to Bob Dylan. That comparison would follow him for years, popping up in reviews and interviews and casual conversations. But over time, something shifted. People started to hear the difference. They started to understand that what Jackson was doing wasn't imitation or homage. It was something entirely his own, something raw and immediate and deeply personal. Because Dylan wrote like a prophet, like someone who could see the whole picture from a distance. But Jackson wrote like a man standing in the middle of his own life, trying to make sense of it in real time. He wrote about the small, painful moments that most people tried to forget. The morning after a fight, the moment you realize someone doesn't love you anymore, the feeling of driving alone at night, wondering where you went wrong. He didn't offer answers. He didn't pretend to have it all figured out. He just described what it felt like to be human, to be flawed, to be searching. And that honesty, that willingness to be vulnerable without being weak, became his signature. But it all started in that studio on that afternoon when a producer made a comparison and Jackson quietly refused it. When he insisted on being seen for who he actually was, not who he reminded people of. That small act of self-definition, that gentle but firm refusal, set the tone for everything that came after. Because the hardest thing in the world is to be yourself when everyone wants you to be someone else. When people want to fit you into categories they already understand. When they want to compare you to something familiar instead of seeing you as something new. And the bravest thing you can do is say no, not loudly, not aggressively, but calmly and clearly, to say, I know you think you see someone else when you look at me, but you're wrong. Look again, listen closer, I'm not who you think I am. That's what Jackson did that day, and in doing so, he gave himself permission to follow his own path, to write his own songs, to trust his own voice, even when that voice wasn't what people expected, even when it didn't fit neatly into the boxes that critics and producers and fans wanted to put it in. The sun was setting as he drove through the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He thought about the woman from the song. He wondered where she was now, whether she ever thought about him, whether she knew she'd ended up in a song that thousands of people would someday hear, whether she'd recognize herself in the lyrics. Probably not. People rarely do. We're all the heroes of our own stories, and we don't always see ourselves the way others see us. We don't always realize the impact we have, the spaces we leave behind when we go. Jackson turned onto a quieter street, away from the traffic. The houses here were small, with lawns and fences and kids playing in driveways. Normal life. The kind of life that doesn't make it into songs very often. The kind of life that just happens day after day without anyone paying much attention. But that was the life he wanted to write about. Not the big moments, not the dramatic confrontations or the triumphant victories, but the quiet, in-between moments, the ordinary heartbreaks, the small disappointments, the everyday courage it takes to wake up and try again when everything feels broken. He pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. The house was dark. He'd been at the studio since morning, and now it was almost night. He sat in the car for another minute, not ready to go inside yet, not ready to face the silence. Eventually, he got out and walked to the front door. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The house was quiet, empty, just him and his thoughts and the song still swirling around in his head. He made himself some coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere in the city, people were going about their lives, falling in love, falling out of love, making mistakes, trying to fix them. Living the same small dramas that he'd tried to capture in his songs. And tomorrow, he'd go back to the studio, he'd work on more tracks, he'd wrestle with more lyrics, he'd try to find the right words to describe feelings that didn't have easy names. And maybe, if he was lucky, he'd create something that mattered, something that helped people feel less alone. But tonight, he just sat in the quiet, grateful for the music, grateful for the struggle. Grateful for that moment in the studio when he'd finally found the courage to say who he was. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Stand up for our own truth, refuse to be diminished, insist on being seen, not as an echo of someone else, but as ourselves, fully, completely, without apology. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to do that, people listen, really listen, and they hear something they've never heard before, something honest and raw and real, something that sounds like life.